The next part of my journey took me up into them there hills, to the Monteverde cloud forest, which, on arrival, was living up to its name. However, the rainbow was a sign of things brightening up, and I arrived at my Spartan cabin at the El Bosque Eco Lodge in sunshine. Don't let the Photoshop work on their website fool you. These cabins were dingy, but they were cheap, and they came with a pet agouti and a few birds in the garden. I legged it up the road to Curicancha Reserve, but failed to make the last admission time at 3 p.m. However, there were a few birds feeding around the car park, including a fantastic green violet here, sucking up all the nectar it could from a stand of porterweed. On leaving the site, I stopped for a pair of very tame Lessons motmots, and while taking their photos, turned around to find a rufous cap warbler attacking itself in my car mirror. I returned to Curicancha early next morning and spent most of the day walking the trails. One of the highlights, as with most places in Costa Rica, was a hummingbird garden, and so I just let the camera roll to see what it picked up. I also set the camera up next to a group of people gathered under a tree and waited for the wind to blow to reveal a roosting mottled owl. It was obvious that one bad-tempered child didn't like owls, and so I was glad to get news from other birders that resplendent quetzals were being seen in a group of trees half-mile away. I legged it as fast as I could and set the camera up to wait for more branches to blow out of the way, this time to reveal several quetzals. The resplendent quetzal is Costa Rica's star bird, and it was as much a relief as anything else to get this bird under my belt so early in the trip, and to get away from the screaming kid. The resplendent quetzal was considered divine by pre-Columbian civilizations, and many myths and legends surround it. Its call is rather dull, but one Mayan legend claims that the quetzal used to sing beautifully before the Spanish conquest, but has been silent ever since. Apparently, it will sing once again only when the land is truly free. In the trees next to the quetzals, I was also lucky to pick out this elegant euphonia, which didn't seem so bothered by Spaniards and had a slightly more varied song. Unfortunately, the weather turned as I ascended to another forest at Santa Helena, where only a few birds were seen. There weren't many good bird songs here either, but I did pick up the wonderful sound of a cleaner hoovering the visitor centre. The following morning wasn't too clever weather-wise either, and was a washout. Although, before I left, the weather picked up, as I had brunch at a fantastic Stella's bakery, with good food and good birds in the garden. The brightening weather also allowed for some great views over the Gulf of Nicoya, where I ended up a couple of hours later at the coastal village of Chomes. Key birds at Chomes were the mangrove warbler and the mangrove swallow, and there was a supporting cast of a few other shorebirds, including a very posy black-bellied plover. Further down the coast, I stopped at an interesting looking lagoon at Mate de Limon, but didn't find much of interest except a bunch of laughing gulls behaving very oddly next to a rock on the beach. Further investigation revealed the remains of what looked like a Chinese takeaway buried in the sand, with the gulls finding weeks-old egg-fried rice rather delicious. Lovely. My accommodation for the next couple of days was at the Cerro Lodge, virtually next door to the Carara National Park, and where my bathroom was as big as the entire cabin at my lodgings in Monteverde. Arriving towards sunset, I picked up a few scarlet macaws flying to roost, and had a pair of rufous nape wrens hanging around the lodge's restaurant. I then settled down with a few local capuchins and watched the highlights of Chelsea Man U on the iPad. The capuchins showed they were as bemused as I was at some of the VAR decisions that went against the Blues, and we all retired to bed very unhappy, although one of them did blow me a kiss goodnight. As Carara National Park doesn't open until 8 AM, I spent breakfast with the capuchins as well, along with a couple of scarlet macaws and some other goodies that came in to feed at the lodge's feeding station. This was a great start to what was probably the most action-packed day of the whole trip. I had hired a guide for the morning in the national park, and we first went to a lek of orange-coloured mannequins, albeit in the gloom of the understory. However, the morning will be remembered for seeing 5 different species of trogon. Unfortunately, I couldn't get a photo of the black-headed trogon, but I'd already got a shot of that species in Palo Verde. On the way back to the lodge for lunch, I made a stop at the famous bridge, well famous in Costa Rica, over the Tarcoles River. Everybody and their mother gets out at this bridge, walks to the middle and looks down, for very easy views of very large American crocodiles. A big industry has sprung up around these crocodiles, and, further down the road, coachloads of tourists are put on boats and taken back up the river for much closer views of the crocs, and sometimes for feeding displays. The Tarcoles River is also the best place in Costa Rica to find a couple of avian specialities, and I was fortunate to have teamed up with an American mother and daughter who I'd met at the lodge, and who were more interested in sharing the cost of a boat tour to see the birds, rather than join gaggles of cruise boat tourists looking for thrills from big reptiles. As a result, the boat we hired took off in the opposite direction to all the other loud boats, but we were soaked to the skin in about 10 minutes. Fortunately, it wasn't long before the rain stopped, and we got to see both the key species, the mangrove hummingbird and mangrove vireo. No photos of the vireo, but it was about as dull as the hummingbird. However, It wasn't just about these two birds, as we had a great couple of hours avoiding the crocodile spectaculars and watching all the other wildlife. After a very long but productive day, I had an early night to ensure I was up once again at dawn and exploring the grounds and forests of another hotel just up the road from the Cerro Lodge. I kept seeing these plants everywhere and eventually found out that they were banana flowers. I felt I should have known this, but I couldn't remember ever seeing them before on my travels. There was a fair selection of wildlife on the property of Villas Lapas, including this common basilisk, otherwise known as the Jesus Christ lizard, as it stands upright and can speedily run across water. I just saw them sunbathing on rocks, which apparently Jesus also used to do quite a lot. Even by 10 AM it was probably way too hot for the lizards to be running anywhere, and I gave up birding as it was also way too hot for me, and you couldn't hear any bird calls for the racket of the cicadas. Bloody hell, it's hot. Due to the heat, I retreated to the air conditioning of my car and headed down Route 34, otherwise known as the South Coastal Drive, alongside the Pacific Ocean, only stopping for views of a strange mixed flock of soaring birds, consisting of magnificent frigate birds and turkey vultures. As the afternoon wore on, I made another stop at Palo Seco, when I noticed several kingfishers fishing from telegraph wires at the side of the road. As seemed to be the pattern with my travel, I arrived at Hacienda Baru late afternoon, and then ventured out to the local aeroplane for dinner, as you do. It took so long I came out in the dark, finding the whole restaurant in an aeroplane experience to be rather more style than substance. TripAdvisor, 3 stars. Birding the grounds and forest at Hacienda Baru proved to be quite hard work the following morning, but the grey-headed tanager was very obliging and was the only one of my trip. For a bit of a sea breeze, I headed down to the beach, but hastily retreated due to no birds and the presence of 3 girls in their late teens with a look on their faces that said, "What's this weird, overweight, pale, sweaty old guy doing next to us on the beach?" So, I continued the journey south to the Osa Peninsula, purportedly the most biodiverse place on the planet, and with me, a weird, overweight, pale, sweaty old subspecies of a human, adding to the biodiversity, if not improving it. On the Osa, I stayed a couple of nights at the Bosque del Rio Tigre, arriving just in time to see the regular late afternoon visit of the localised black-cheeked ant tanager to the lodge's feeders. The owners of the lodge, Liz and Abraham Gallo, know where all the good birds are, and I went out with Abraham for a guided tour the following morning. Abraham was a fantastic guide, and how he picked things up I'll never know. He asked what I wanted to see, and when I said a turquoise cotinga, he found one that was so far away I thought it was in Mexico. This video was taken at 180 times magnification. I was somewhat disappointed that he couldn't identify the little brown job at the top of the tree behind it. Call yourself a bird guide? I don't think even Abraham had expected the next fantastic sighting, as we disturbed 2 black vultures together with a king vulture by the side of the path. Usually, unless you go to a specific feeding station right at the northern tip of the country, birders' views of king vultures in Costa Rica are usually of birds soaring way overhead. To have discovered this one right next to us was very lucky, to say the least. It was very hot and sweaty, even in the early morning, and we were having a hard slog trying to find birds in the forest. We stumbled across an ant trail, which is usually a magnet for feeding birds, but were disappointed to see not a thing. However, Abraham had his usual stakeouts for a few things, so all was not lost. Arriving back to base mid-morning, I just sat and wallowed in sweat for a few hours, watching the birds and butterflies around the lodge. While sat relaxing, I noticed a bit of movement on the ground and found a little tinamou and its youngster walking around the back of the lodge. It then became obvious that the best way to film this very secretive bird was to look through the kitchen, where it was picking up rice along with quite a few blue ground doves.
We're going to have Are you doing video?
By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped to the low 30s, and so I ventured along the Rio Tigre, finding a few things, including a nesting boat-billed heron. A good meal from the Tinamou kitchen with some simultaneous spotlighting of frogs capped off the day. I jibbed off my final morning at the lodge as I yearned for the car's aircon once again. Furthermore, early morning was supposed to be the best time to be at a river crossing called the Rincon Bridge, which is the best place in the world to try to see the endangered yellow-billed cotinga. The bridge was about an hour's drive from the lodge, but it seemed from the road signs that I was never going to get there. The yellow-billed cotinga is thought to be down to somewhere between 150 and 700 adult birds. Fortunately, I arrived in the nick of time to see 3 birds way up in the tops of the trees for only a few minutes, hence only a field guide picture. And that was that as far as the cotingas were concerned, but there were plenty of other things at this great little spot. Driving off the Osa Peninsula and towards the San Vito area back up in the mountains, I made a quick lunch stop at Las Gambas, where I'd read about some good forest. I picked up a few more species and then lucked out again when I stopped for a pee, too much information, and heard a call that I actually recognised as one I'd specifically learnt for the trip. I then managed to call the bird in, which was a royal flycatcher, another bird that I'd really wanted to find. I made my last good find of the day when I almost hit a band-tailed barbthroat, which had a nest hanging over the edge of the road. Risking being run over, I managed to grab some nice footage of this hummingbird before heading up into the hills.